Hi, I'm Jamie. This is Dead Dodge Garage, and this ain't good. Cast your mind back a few weeks to my video where I explained I was going to be doing a Performance 318 build in a 1968 Barracuda for my friend Mark. This is that engine. If you recall, in that video, I tore this engine down and found a couple issues. The only reason I was tearing it down at all was a leaking what I'm going to call freeze plug, because now all the commenters want me to call them freeze plugs. Anyway, one of these things on the back of the motor was bad, so we got this engine out and found some other horrible things. The crank walked in and out quite a bit, which led me to discover a bad thrust bearing. And the reason for that bad thrust bearing is this cap does not register correctly in the block. Because of that, there is no way around taking this engine to the machine shop, so I'm breaking it down to do exactly that. Now, it just so happens that in my collection of junk, I found a spare thrust bearing main cap. When you change the main caps on your engine, generally speaking, they're going to have to be line bored to make sure everything lines up correctly. And that's what would have to happen with this. However, I want to demonstrate to you, if I can get it in place, this one actually fits in the register in the block. See how it locks in and it doesn't move? That's what you want to see. If the bore on this one is close enough that my local machine shop can hone it to the right dimension, then that's what we're going to do. If not, we may use a clever trick to try and get this one to lock in place where it's supposed to be. But I'm going to let the machine shop make that determination. The original plan for this engine was to make some quick, cheap, and effective horsepower modifications to see what we could get out of this 318 by doing almost nothing at all. Just a quick cam and spring and manifold change. That's really all we had planned. Unfortunately, just about everything about this said, you got bigger problems than that. And another one of those things was the mismatched pair of cylinder heads on the engine. This, as you can see, is a closed chamber head. This is from a 273, and this is an original 318 head. Shortly after I released the video, Mark found this. That's a set of correct 318 open chamber heads. As you can see, they've been sitting around for a while. For some reason, all of the valves are sitting in them upside down, and most of them are rusted in place. So that's kind of a problem. More recently, Mark found another pair of these closed chamber 273 heads. They had to be the 66 heads with the correct intake bolts like this one. So now we're getting that set of 273 heads shipped from somewhere across the country, and we'll be going through those, doing some horsepower modifications and having them checked at the machine shop. All I was doing this morning was tearing this engine down to get it to the machine shop. The pistons and rods are going in a box, the crank will get wrapped in a bag, and we'll throw this thing in the back of the truck. However, I found more stuff tearing this engine down, and so I thought it was worth it to show that to you. Just to give you an idea of what horrors might lurk in your ancient, never rebuilt 318 Chrysler engine. In case you forgot, this is what the thrust bearing from that main cap that did not stay in place looks like. It's not pretty. The thrust surfaces are completely wiped. And the way I found this without looking in the engine was I grabbed the crank and I was able to move it in and out quite a bit. I actually showed the measurement there in the last video, but basically it should have a little bit of in and out. It should not have excessive in and out. And the journal that bearing wrote on also completely wiped. Anything that you can catch your fingernail on your crankshaft, that's bad. Every other journal is beautiful. If it weren't for that issue, this crank would be fine, and we'd just put it back in. So now I'm knocking pistons out, and then we'll get the crank out, assess the rest of that, look at the bores and that sort of thing. In the last video, I tried to ID this bearing. That's something you can do to figure out the history of your engine, at least to a certain degree. For some reason, these crank bearings don't have a date or any other useful information on them. This one just says 28 TC, I think. The rod bearing, however, is a different story. Each one of these is labeled 500-C, 5 of 68, if you can see that. So this engine's original. This bottom end has never been apart. We know one cylinder head was changed, obviously, but nothing else important has ever been done to this thing. With that in mind, it may not surprise you to learn that every rod bearing in this engine is completely roached. Obviously, they were still functioning. I haven't found any that had spun yet, although they were pretty close to that, which I'll show you in a minute. However, it's easy to see the copper showing across the full face of every one of these bearings. Yeah, it's just worn out. These are going to be loose. Tons and tons of oil clearance. Also, you can see the interesting stripes on a couple of these. I think this is the one. Yeah, with a neat spot on the back. It looks like something was jammed behind this bearing when it was installed. That's pretty cool. Don't think I've ever seen that before. Also, as mentioned, these were not spinning, but you can see evidence of possible movement. And the fit to the rods and caps, not great, let's say. Here's the rod cap with the mark that matches that bearing shell. Again, very interesting. I can't catch a fingernail on either side of it, so I don't know if the debris that was there is just embedded in the metal now or what that is. Never seen such a thing. Anyway, if you don't know, when you're putting an engine like this together, your bearing halves are going to snap into their respective caps or sections of the block or rods. That keeps them in place, and it should keep them from spinning. The spinning part is inside the bearing. If the bearing shell itself ever spins, that is a recipe for disaster. So obviously this is bad. The fact that these just fall right out of here. These are just worn out rod bearings. Again, not toasted or anything, and the crank journals appear fine, but that's not good. So now I'm pulling the rods and pistons, laying them out in the order they came out in, and I am numbering them as I go. If your engine's been rebuilt before, the numbers for the matching cylinder will probably already be punched into the rod and the rod cap, but these have no such markings. Something else I found very interesting. As I'm removing these, of course you kind of gotta give them a little love tap to get the caps off. They do click into place like they're supposed to. They're tight on the rod bolts there. Yep, another beautiful rod bearing. But these pistons, well, they just kind of fall out. It's common in a worn engine like this, due to the ridge at the top of the cylinder, your pistons don't want to come out at all, and sometimes you got to do some persuading. These are just falling right out. Maybe I can do this without dropping it. Maybe. There you go. It just pops right out of the hole. That's not supposed to happen. And speaking of things that aren't supposed to happen, piston rings. They're not supposed to be two-piece. If you've ever heard the term blow-by and wondered what that is, here's the best example of it I've ever seen. This is combustion that was clearly running right past the piston ring. Now in this case, it's because this ring is broken. And in case you're thinking, well, Jamie, you must have broken that taking it out. No, I didn't. It wouldn't be scored black like that if that had just happened. It should be shiny all the way around where it contacts with the cylinder wall. But because this one was broken in half, it's not. There's a horrible chunk on each piece of this ring where combustion was just going right by it. Yeah, that's a great way to throw away power and a great way to score your cylinder walls. We'll be taking a close look at all of those when I get the pistons out. I did notice something in this engine I was not expecting to find. You see the clip here? That is retaining the wrist pin because these are actually floaters. What that means is instead of being pressed into place, that is you press the pin into the rod to secure the piston on it, it floats in the rod. These are actually bushed rods, which is great for performance. The clips are used to keep the pin from walking out of the piston. The piston's able to spin on the pin's able to rotate in the rod, and that gives you the least resistance as the piston and rod are going through their cycle. That's great for making power. So far I've found 3 broken top rings in this engine. Here's another way too easy piston removal. They shouldn't just fall out like that. No broken rings on this one. These look pretty good. Nice shiny pattern all the way around. Of course they brought some carbon with them when they came out, but that's not a big deal at all. Those you could reuse, if you were really cheap. Oil ring moves. Only slightly crudted up in there. Sometimes you'll pull these out and the rings will be stuck. This rod bearing is almost still good. Almost. Notice these original rod bearings have a notch there. That is to accommodate an oil passageway. Each one of these rod bearings shoots oil out to the opposing bank. I believe the purpose was extra lubrication for the rings. In heavy-duty diesels with turbos, you often see some kind of oil squirter sending oil to the piston skirts to cool them, so maybe they had that in mind as well. Either way, these were removed from aftermarket bearings, so apparently someone somewhere deemed it unnecessary. Last piston, number 8, came out, another broken top ring. That's a total of 4. One of them was actually in 3 sections, the rest are in 2. Notice the shiny sections on the ends of the broken pieces there? It'll be interesting to see if there's any scraping from that. Of course, there is a second ring, and every one of these second rings below the broken top rings still look good. They're shiny, so this thing would have had some compression, but one does have to wonder what the compression numbers looked like. Given that it had 2 different cylinder heads, it stands to reason the compression numbers side to side would have been interesting. Speaking of interesting, the rings that were broken, number 3, and then the rear 3 on the passenger side. With all the rods off, the crank spins very nicely. It just also does this. And it still did that when it had a top thrust surface too. Now I'll be pulling the rest of the main caps and we'll get the crank out of there. Number 4, I remember now, is a little bit loose. So we're gonna have to have that addressed as well. It's certainly not as bad as number 3. And again, a good looking bearing. Now it's always good practice to lay parts out in the order you remove them, the orientation you remove them, and just kind of make yourself a little map of all of the components. Now if you do get them mixed up, these main caps are all numbered. You can see 1, 2, 3, 4. And if you get them flipped end for end, when you install them, the notch on the cap matches the notch in the block. As long as you're paying attention to the bearing, you cannot install these wrong. That's what you want to see. A perfect press fit. Oh, dang it, it went back in. I need more hands. Do they sell extra hands anywhere? Yeah, rear main bearing looks really good. Old school rope seal? Not so much. And that's a terrible smell. If you've had a few old engines taken apart in your day, you know what that smells like. It's not pleasant. Nasty old burned oil. Here's our forged crankshaft out of the engine. Seriously, every journal on this thing is like perfect. And there's the slightest ghost of something there, but you can't even feel it. This would have been a really nice piece, ready to run again, if not for that. Of course, if not for that issue, I never would have had this engine apart, and I never would have found all those broken rings. So, a lot of good came out of that. Anyway, we'll have this thing cleaned up, and we will be reusing it. As long as it passes the ring test, of course. Oh, come on. Oh yeah, that's a good one. Here's a look at the upper shells of the main bearings, still in the block. All of them are great, except 3, which looks just like the one in the cap. Okay, I mean, I say great. They're passable. You know, the surfaces don't look amazing. There's certainly a little bit of wear, but there should be. I mean, they've seen some stuff. Speaking of seeing some stuff, I wanted to show you what I found in the oil pan after letting this drain for a couple days. Some sludge, like quite a bit of sludge. Gross. And some bits. I think most of this is disintegrating valve seals. It's kind of like rubbery, plasticky stuff. That's pretty typical to see. Ugh. Not much metal, although there are a couple little shards, and I suspect that's all cam bearing. There's a little ball of metal. Did I mention this is disgusting? Yeah, well, it is. Overall, not bad. Not as bad as Mitch's engine. Main caps are snug back in place for this thing's ride to the machine shop tomorrow. I'm going to have to leave the dipstick tube. Hopefully it survives the experience. These are pressed in place, and while you can try and drive them out from the backside, look at this tiny hole. It's challenging. More often than not, they end up broken. Hey, remind me to invest in some of those engine stand oil trays. You know, I only just realized they actually sprayed the copper coat directly on the block when they did this. We always spray it on the gasket and let it tack up a little bit, which I believe is what it says to do in the instructions. I'm always impressed by these weird patterns above the cylinders. I mean, you could see quite clearly the head gasket was not doing its job. I'll have these surfaces checked. The block might well get decked. We will just have to see. Whatever it needs is what'll happen. Here's a look at those even side bores that all had broken rings. I don't really see any horrible scrapes. There are some, obviously, but none of that's that bad. I mean, it's typical to see that in a good running engine anyway. Now, number 4 here does have a weird pattern of what appears to be rust. Can't feel that. It's pretty much just staining. Number 3 here has very similar rust staining. Again, not the worst. It looks nothing like the 273 I just got into last week. Overall, other than that number 3 main cap issue, this block would be fine. But instead, it's going to go to the machine shop and get all the things done. And that'll be great too. Just not quite the budget deal I had in mind. And that really gets me to the point of this video. You see, I love budget engine builds. They're like my favorite. I love the idea of doing a lot with very little. The 360 engine in Dale's Demon, which is under this car cover somewhere, is a great example of that. It's like a nothing build. It's a Smog 360 with some performance pistons that were used, a home hone job, a used camshaft, home ported heads, springs. It really didn't take much to make this thing awesome. And awesome it is. In fact, in a future video, I'm going to go over this combination. I explained it extensively in previous videos, but those were a long time ago, so I want to do one big wrap up, explain how you can build a 360 just like this, and then I'm going to put it on a chassis dyno, because we got to know. I got very excited about this project when Mark brought it to me because it was another chance to practice my real love, hot rodding. The goal there is to avoid an expensive trip to the machine shop. The goal is to work with what you have. And we were so close to having that on this one. Except we also weren't. The bores on this engine are so worn the pistons just kind of fall out of them. And of course, compression rings broken in half. Not a good recipe for success. On this channel, I'm always going to be looking for cheap ways to do things. I'm always going to be looking for projects like this that do not require the backing of a major financial institution or Holly or whatever. I love junk. It's some of my favorite stuff to work with. It's just so satisfying. Anyone can go out and buy horsepower. Unfortunately, the lesson we have to take here is one that many other builders have known for eons. Just because an engine is running and seems healthy doesn't mean it is. That doesn't mean it's a good candidate for making power. And really what you need to do before you pursue any build like this is do your due diligence. Maybe do a compression test. I really regret omitting that step at this point. Check every single thing you can and make sure it's actually good. Make no assumptions. In fact, it's almost better if you assume that everything is bad. A whole bunch of people asked why we don't just go out and get another 318 block instead of saving this one. This is the original engine from that Barracuda. And while it's not a rare numbers matching unit, it is all original, well, except for one cylinder head, and we'd really like to keep it that way. So as long as the machine shop says this is savable, it's getting saved. Hopefully I'll have a set of buildable cylinder heads for this engine soon. I am looking forward to getting into those. We're just going to do a basic cleanup, simple porting job, very much like I did on the Turbo Slant 6 recently. That'll be a lot of fun, and I may even do a video on it. In the meantime, I can move on to other things, like resealing this entire transmission, which I'm not looking forward to. Anyway, hopefully you enjoyed that. Just some more horrors lurking in a classic Chrysler engine. If you've got one at home you're thinking about building, tread carefully, that's all I can say. Anyway, until next time, as ever, thank you very much for watching. And remember, trust, but verify. All right, that's a good one. Yeah, check your cam bearings. Or don't, if you don't want to know.